let's run through how to do an ANOVA with all 6 steps. Now, these are going to look a little different. Like each time I teach you a test, something differs just a little bit. But I do want to point out that these are subtle little differences. The main concept of the 6 steps are the same, but there's probably more change this time than we've seen before. So let's start with a prompt. A study compared the felt intensity of unrequited love among 3 groups: individuals who are currently experiencing unrequited love, individuals who had previously experienced unrequited love, and individuals who had experienced unrequited love and described their experiences retrospectively, and individuals who had never experienced unrequited love but described how they thought it would feel if they were to experience it. So determine if felt intensity of unrequited love differs by experience. In other words, unrequited love is when you love someone and they don't love you back and it's really painful. And they wanted to know if that pain of unrequited love was the felt intensity of it was the same for those who currently felt it, those who felt it once before and remembering it, and those who never felt it and are trying to imagine what it would be like. So notice that I have 3 groups: current, retrospective, and imagined. If I had only had 2 groups, current and retrospective, I could do an independent T. But because I have 3 groups, I have to do an ANOVA. I'd like to point out that the data are going to look like this, which looks a lot like how the independent T would have come to us. But in the independent T, we would have just had 2 conditions. But now that we have 3 conditions, we have to run an ANOVA. So let's do our 6 steps. Our first step is going to say, does felt intensity of unrequited love differ by experience? Notice that I'm not specifying, is this one above this one or this one below this one, or are these 2 different? I'm being very generic in my statement, and that's required of the omnibus test for the ANOVA. We aren't going to get into specifics unless we find a significant difference. So we can do step 2 in 2 ways. Let's try the trick that I've always taught you, which is take your research question and turn it into a statement and then add not. So for step 2, if I were going to do the steps we've been doing in the past, we could say for the null, felt intensity of unrequited love does not differ by experience. And then for the alternative, felt intensity of unrequited love differs by experience. Notice this rule still works for us. Let's see how this would look as symbols. So the null would be mu1, mu2, mu3, where 1, 2, and 3 stand for current, retrospective, and imagined. But notice that for the alternative, I'm not writing mu1 does not equal to mu2 does not equal to mu3. Because that image there, mu1 not equal to mu2 not equal to mu3, would suggest that I know that all are not equal from each other. But I don't know if that's the case. All I know is there's a difference in there somewhere, and I don't know where it is. Remember, the omnibus test has a bag. It's not telling us where the difference is. They're just saying there's something in there. It may be that mu1 doesn't equal mu2. Or maybe they do, and it's mu2 that doesn't equal mu3. Or maybe they're fine, but it's mu1 that doesn't equal mu3. See how there's so many different ways that this could manifest? And since any of those would be sufficient as an alternative, we are only going to just say that the null is false, or they're not all the same. So even though not all the same is not a symbol, it's a phrase, that is the closest we can do for symbols for the null hypothesis. So I like to say the alternative is they're not all the same. Now let's talk about step 3. We talked about how we would need 2 degrees of freedom to identify the critical F value that would determine our rejection region, and any score above that would be in the rejection region. I feel as though this might be an unnecessary step. I would need to have you have a new table, and now it's kind of more complicated by 2 sets of degrees of freedom. But I'd also like to remind you, we've been getting better at using JASP, and JASP always gives us the probability value. And no matter which test we do, an independent T or a dependent T or an ANOVA, if the p-value is less than 0.05, that means we're going to reject the null. So for step 3, we can now say where we're going to reject the null if the p-value is less than 0.05. I'd like to shift gears to using this as our rejection region because This will allow us to use this phrase for all future tests. We don't have to look up new critical T's and F's because this is always going to be true. Any p-value less than 0.05 means that we're going to reject the null. So now that we have the data open, let's go ahead and run our ANOVA. We're going to click on Analyze, Compare Means and Proportions, and then we're going to scroll down to One-Way ANOVA. So your dependent list is going to be your outcome variable, and that's always going to be something that's interval or ratio. So in that case, that's going to be the feeling that's reported. And then the factor is going to be the conditions. While we're here, let's go ahead and select post hoc. We should look to see if it's significant before we run the post hoc, but let's go ahead and click post hoc so we can have it in our output. The three that I'm going to be testing you on is Tukey, Bonferroni, and Chaffee. Now, Bonferroni I teach just because it's easier to understand, so we can take it off because it's actually not the most ideal post hoc to run. But let's go ahead and run both the Tukey and the Chaffee. Now remember, we use the Tukey when we have equal sample sizes, and we use the Chaffee when we don't. But we can click both. Okay, so we're set. Let's go ahead and click OK. All right, so now we have our output. So let's go ahead and talk about what we see here. So remember when we talked about how we run an ANOVA, we get our sums of squares between the groups and our sums of squares within the groups. So this is the variability within, the variability between. And then we divide, so to get to our F, we take the sums of squares between, divided by the degrees of freedom between, and that'll give us the mean squared between. Then we find the sums of squares within, divided by the degrees of freedom within, and that gives us the mean squared within. The mean squared between divided by the mean squared within gives us the F value. So here's our calculated test statistic. This is our F value. And then here's our significance level. And so remember, it is significant if it's less than 0.05. If you're not clear how to interpret this significance p-value, go back to previous lectures where we talk about p-values, and that'll give you a reminder. So we won't worry too much about this output that's giving us a little bit more detailed information, but we also did ask for post hoc. Now you can't look at post hoc information unless you have received a significant result above. So if this report were not significant, you should ignore the post hoc tests. But in this case, it was significant, so we can scroll down. So let me show you what it's doing here. For the Tukey and the Chaffee, it's telling you each paired comparison. Now we can use the Tukey because you can see here the sample size for all the conditions is 4. So that means we are okay using the Tukey. We don't need to use the Chaffee. So what we can see here is it starts by saying those who imagined what it would feel like to have unrequited love compared to those who are retrospectively remembering what it was once like feeling unrequited love. The mean difference between those two groups is -4, the standard error, and here's their significance level. You see how it's 0.01? We interpret this significance level just the way we did above. So anything less than 0.05 is significant. So that means that imagined versus retrospective are significantly different from each other. Now let's look at imagine versus currently feeling it. Imagine versus currently feeling unrequited love is also significantly different. So these two groups also differ. Now we have to do all the other paired comparisons. Retrospective versus imagined is going to be the same as imagine versus retrospective. It's just putting it in a different order. So it's showing us it's significant. But now let's look at retrospective versus currently feeling unrequited love. We hadn't looked at that comparison yet. And we see here this significance value is 1, which means there's not a significant difference between those who are imagining what it, or sorry, those who are remembering what it was like to be have unrequited love versus those who are currently experiencing unrequited love. So that's really important to note. And so we already looked at current versus imagined and current versus retrospective up above in different order. So we don't really need to look at this significance because it's just repeating the same information. To help us understand what the differences are, we can look at this table, which is giving us the means. So what we can see is for those who are imagining what it was like to feel unrequited love, the mean was 6. Versus those who were remembering what it was like, the mean for that was 10. It was more intense. And then those who are currently feeling unrequited love also felt it as a 10. So these two latter groups didn't differ, but they did differ from imagining what it was like. So basically, you could use your imagination, but you don't get the same feeling. And so when you are trying to report this, you have to be really clear how all three groups relate to each other. You can't just say there was a difference. You have to really clarify where the differences were. So we just calculated this in JASP, and we found that our observed F, or our calculated F, was 8.727. So notice we have steps 1, 2, 3, and 4 done. Now we can see from our JASP report that this was significant because the p-value was less than 0.05. So for step 5, we're still going to keep our rejection. We're still going to keep the rule of saying reject the null or fail to reject the null, but this time we can say we reject the null because the p-value, which we saw was 0.008, is less than 0.05. So you see how we are going to reject the null, and if I reject the null, I can no longer say that felt intensity of unrequited love does not differ by experience, but instead felt intensity of unrequited love differs by experience. Now for step 6, you might want to say, oh, okay, so felt intensity of unrequited love differs by experience. But you can't just leave people hanging like that. You need to tell them exactly where the differences were. So in step 6, this is where we have to go look at the post hocs to be able to make our conclusion. And so when we look back at the image, the plot that we saw, and the post hoc results that we got, we are going to use those to drive our conclusions. So for step 6, we're going to say those that can only imagine unrequited love feel it much less intensely than those who have once felt it or are currently feeling it. See how I'm pointing out that the imagined are much less intensely feeling it than those who felt it or are currently feeling it? But I'm still missing something. I don't want to leave out this last statement. The latter two do not differ. I need to point out that having felt it once before and having be in the throes of it right now, they did not significantly differ when we looked at the post hoc. You can't leave this piece out, and many students do. You can't have the assumption that if I didn't talk about it, it wasn't different, because you just leave people hanging. So what we want to say is that those who imagine feeling unrequited love had a much less intensity of feeling it than those who were remembering it or those who are currently in it. But remembering it and currently in it equally feel the intensity. It's not like you forget it over time. They're equally intense with their feelings. So these two sentences would be required for a proper conclusion about this test. Now, sometimes it's going to take one sentence, sometimes it'll take 2, sometimes it'll take 4. There is really only no one way to do it, but you need to make sure you're clear who was low, who was high, who differed, who didn't differ.